evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
With these ominous words, President John F. Kennedy reveals to a shocked American public a crisis unlike any other in history. At the personal order of Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, 36 ballistic missiles, each capable of hurling more nuclear destruction at the United States than was carried by all the bombers in all of World War II, are being moved to launch sites on the communist-controlled island of Cuba. Under the very noses of the U.S. administration and military, Khrushchev has installed a Soviet nuclear threat just 90 miles off the American coast. If these bases are allowed to become fully operational, most of the major cities in the United States will potentially be only minutes away from destruction. America will be vulnerable to Soviet nuclear blackmail, and her position as leader of the free world will be in jeopardy. Now, John Kennedy, the youngest president the United States has ever had, is face to face with the gravest challenge ever confronted by an American head of state. Somehow he must find a way to reverse Khrushchev's stunning nuclear gambit. With so much riding on his every decision, Kennedy will have to become far more than the civilian leader of his country. As no president before him, he will be forced by the extraordinary nature of the crisis to act as a true military commander-in-chief, taking direct charge of the day-by-day strategic moves and counter-moves of the U.S. armed forces that could achieve his goals or plunge the world into thermonuclear war. Kennedy is intensely aware of the massive responsibility that rests on his shoulders. He will have to personally oversee one of the most complex and crucial military operations ever undertaken. One wrong move, one misunderstood command, and a sensitive tripwire chain reaction will be set in motion that could result in the destruction of the human race. On the other side of the globe, Premier Nikita Khrushchev tensely assesses the actions of the young president. Over the last several months, he has become increasingly involved in making military decisions of his own. The most far-reaching of these had been to secretly send Soviet missiles to Cuba. For Khrushchev, it is a colossal gamble. If he is successful, he will completely alter the military and political balance of power, vaulting his nation and his communist system into parity with the overwhelming nuclear might of the United States at a single stroke. If he fails, it will be a crushing blow to Soviet power, to his reputation as a world leader, even to his survival as premier of the Soviets. For Khrushchev to prevail, he will have to command and control his military forces with the same skill that is demanded of Kennedy. But Khrushchev's strategy is not only a matter of missiles and megatons. At its heart lies his personal assessment of Kennedy himself. The Soviet premier is convinced that the comparatively youthful and inexperienced American president will back down in the face of his bold nuclear threats. But Kennedy is equally resolved to stand firm. And as he addresses America on October 22nd, he makes his determination clear to the whole world.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
The world is on the brink of a nuclear precipice. The Cuban Missile Crisis has begun. For John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, the crisis will be the defining moment of their careers. For the next 6 days, these two civilian leaders will be locked in a tense, hair-trigger military showdown that will threaten to shatter the limits of their psychological endurance. Kennedy and Khrushchev, two men separated by vast differences in culture, age, and ideology, are now inexorably linked by a single fact. For a brief period of time, the fate of mankind rests in their hands. Although the Cuban Missile Crisis will come to a head in a matter of days, the confrontation has been in the making for nearly 2 decades. Its origins can be traced to the mutual distrust that developed between the United States and the Soviet Union in the years following World War II. September 1945. The empires of Japan and Nazi Germany lay in ruins, as do most of the nations of Western Europe, leaving the United States and the Soviet Union as the predominant world powers. But split by sharply differing security needs, ideologies, and aggressive Soviet expansion, the former allies soon become antagonists. The world quickly becomes divided into 2 hostile camps: the free world led by the United States, and the communist world led by the Soviet Union. The Cold War is born. The conflict will flare white-hot in bloody clashes around the globe, from Greece to Korea to Indochina. But the Caribbean island of Cuba is fated to become the most threatening superpower battleground of them all. January 1st, 1959. After 6 bloody years of struggle, a charismatic young Cuban revolutionary leader named Fidel Castro topples the brutal regime of dictator Fulgencio Batista. When it becomes clear that Castro has strong communist leanings, U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower slaps economic sanctions on the bearded Latin firebrand. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev sees the turmoil in Cuba as an opportunity that can be exploited to his nation's advantage. Khrushchev has only recently emerged from a bitter internal power struggle to become the single, unchallenged leader of the Soviet state. Now he would like nothing better than to boost his reputation with a triumph on the world stage. He begins making overtures to the newly communist Cuba. And in February 1960, Castro signs a treaty with the Soviet Union calling for economic aid and military assistance should Cuba need it. For Khrushchev, it is a major foreign relations coup. He has defied America and helped plant the Soviets' communist banner just 90 miles away from his arch rivals. He has shown his critics at home and abroad that he does indeed belong at the helm of the communist world. But for Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, the climb into the world spotlight has been long and arduous. Born on April 17, 1894, in the tiny rural village of Kalinovka, Nikita Khrushchev spent his boyhood summers tending cows and sheep, and his winters learning to read and write. But education was a luxury for hard-working peasant families, and young Nikita's formal schooling ended after the primary grades. As a teenager, he toiled in the coal mines of the Donbas region of the Ukraine. But in 1917, the communist revolution showed the energetic young miner a path to greater accomplishment. Appalled by the condition of his countrymen under the absolute rule of the Tsars, Khrushchev became an ardent communist. His superiors soon saw in him a natural talent for leadership, and he moved quickly up the party ladder. He served with distinction in the Communist Red Army during the revolution, and in 1929 he was sent to Moscow for further schooling. Here he caught the eye of the Soviet dictator, Joseph Stalin. Khrushchev spent many long hours with the tyrannical leader and used his friendship to navigate the dangerous waters of Soviet politics. In return for advancement, Khrushchev became one of Stalin's loyal henchmen. And as head of the Ukrainian Communist Party in 1938, Khrushchev was instrumental in helping Stalin carry out his bloody purges. During the Second World War, Khrushchev turned his shrewdness and immense vitality toward helping defeat the Nazis. He became one of the supreme political officers, or commissars, in the Red Army. Given military ranking, His job was to ensure the loyalty and obedience of the military generals. But his responsibilities went beyond purely political activities. He helped restore discipline to the Red Army during the disastrous months following the German invasion, and he played an important role in helping to organize guerrilla warfare by Soviet partisans behind German lines. In late 1942, as a lieutenant general, Nikita Khrushchev participated in the planning and execution of the huge counteroffensive that ended with the crushing defeat of the Germans at Stalingrad. This experience of command in the military sphere broadened Khrushchev's leadership skills and increased his already formidable self-confidence. Khrushchev put these qualities to use when, after Stalin's death in 1953, he emerged as one of the key members of the collective leadership that replaced Stalin's autocratic rule. But Khrushchev was hungry for even greater power. He successfully defended himself against a number of plots by political rivals. And in March of 1958, a vote of the party hierarchy confirmed him as the undisputed leader of both the Soviet state and the Communist Party. Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, the unschooled peasant from Kalinovka, had firmly established himself as the head of the most powerful communist country in the world. It was a triumph that was soon enhanced by his budding relationship with Fidel Castro. Yet despite his many achievements, Khrushchev is still uneasy. Though America's estimates of Soviet nuclear power are unrealistically high, he knows that the Soviet Union still lags far behind the United States in the balance of nuclear forces. While Khrushchev commands barely 300 nuclear weapons, America can unleash nearly 5,000 warheads at the Soviet Union on a moment's notice. In effect, the United States can absorb a full-scale Soviet attack and still have enough nuclear weaponry left to incinerate every city in the Soviet Union. For Khrushchev, it is an intolerable situation, and it's getting worse. With its seemingly limitless wealth, the United States is building more bombs than the Soviets can possibly match. Khrushchev believes he must close the gap, and quickly, or his nation and his communist ideology will risk being buried by the capitalist West. At that very moment in the United States, a young American senator is also devoting a great deal of thought to a so-called missile gap. But in his mind, it's the United States that needs to catch up. John Fitzgerald Kennedy is in the midst of a hard-fought presidential campaign. Many published reports seem to back up his contention that the Eisenhower administration has allowed the Soviets to pull ahead in the nuclear numbers game. And even though the junior senator from Massachusetts has been privately assured in official security briefings that the missile gap is a myth, Kennedy remains unconvinced and continues to play on the public's concern. John Kennedy is a man obsessed with winning at almost any cost. But he cloaks his burning ambition with an easygoing charm and a sharp, self-deprecating wit that is unique among American politicians. These qualities, along with his relatively youthful age of 42 years and his wealthy background, have caused many to dismiss him as all style and no substance, a soft, spoiled rich boy who doesn't want to wait his turn. Though Kennedy comes from a privileged family, he is anything but soft. During his lifetime, he has been hardened by a series of physical and emotional trials that might have broken a lesser man. John Kennedy's father, Joseph P. Kennedy, was a tough-minded, self-made millionaire with a lifelong passion for politics and power. He passed these qualities on to his family, instilling in his 9 children a drive to succeed that bordered on mania. Winning was the central goal in the Kennedy household, whether it was a prize at school or in one of the family's games of touch football. This highly competitive atmosphere had an enormous effect on young John and would shape his entire approach to life. Born in 1917, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, or Jack as his family called him, was small and sickly. He was also born with a slightly deformed back that would cause him intense pain throughout his life. But his many illnesses didn't get Jack any special treatment from his parents or his brothers and sisters. His older brother Joe Jr. was particularly hard on Jack, and the two often fought spirited battles. In one incident, Jack and Joe raced around the block on their bicycles in opposite directions. As they headed straight for one another, each stubbornly refused to give way. The resulting collision left Joe unscathed. Jack, on the other hand, needed a trip to the hospital and 28 stitches. But he hadn't backed down. A Kennedy never backed down. This inner toughness served Kennedy well during his action in World War II. Despite his physical infirmities, he was determined to command, to prove that he had his share of what made the Kennedys special. And in 1943, he got his wish when he took charge of a small patrol torpedo boat, the PT-109 in the South Pacific. When the 109 was rammed and sunk by a Japanese destroyer during a night patrol, Lieutenant Kennedy was instrumental in saving the lives of his surviving crewmen. Ignoring the constant pain in his back, he swam for hours, towing a badly burned sailor behind him by holding the strap from the wounded man's life jacket in his teeth. When the crew reached these tiny deserted islands, Kennedy made another extremely hazardous swim of several miles in a vain attempt to flag down a rescue ship. After the crew of the PT-109 was finally found, Lieutenant Kennedy received the Purple Heart and the Navy Life-Saving Medal for heroism. Although there was a good deal of criticism in the Navy of the way Lieutenant Kennedy handled his boat before it was sunk, his bravery during the rescue was undeniable. And Jack's father made sure the incident was widely publicized. The young veteran made the most of his war record when he ran for Congress in 1946. From that time on, the carefully nurtured image of the dashing young PT boat captain became a cornerstone of Kennedy's legendary charisma. After his successful congressional bid, Kennedy's political career skyrocketed. In 1952 and 1958, he was elected to the U.S. Senate, and in 1960, he won the office of president in one of the closest elections in history. As Kennedy takes the oath of office on the blisteringly cold afternoon of January 20th, 1961, he represents a vigorous new spirit of hope to millions of Americans. But the thinly veiled message he sends to the Soviets is as frigid as the weather.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
Yet even as the new president speaks of America's resolve to fight for democracy in a world frozen by Cold War, he offers his Soviet adversaries a choice between cooperation and confrontation.
So let us begin anew, remembering on both sides that civility is not a sign of weakness, and sincerity is always subject to proof. Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate.
Nikita Khrushchev listens closely, taking the measure of the new American leader. But instead of accepting Kennedy's olive branch at face value, the Soviet premier sees it as a sign of weakness. It is a fateful miscalculation, one that sets in motion a chain of events that will culminate in the world's first nuclear crisis. The rough-hewn peasant and the rich man's son have begun their march toward the confrontation that will rock the world. Before this can happen, however, President John Kennedy is destined to fight his first battle of the Cold War. March 11th, 1961. The new commander-in-chief receives his first detailed briefing on a secret plan to overthrow the Castro regime in Cuba. Initiated during the Eisenhower administration, the operation is presented by the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Allen Dulles. It calls for a small force of 750 anti-Castro Cuban exiles to invade the island after a series of airstrikes. It is believed that once the invaders are ashore, they will incite a popular revolution against the Cuban dictator. Kennedy is uneasy about the operation. He believes that Cuba could potentially be a major springboard for communist expansion in the Western Hemisphere. A continued communist presence on the island is also a thorny political problem, and Kennedy will do almost anything to avoid the charge of being soft on communism. But he is apprehensive that America will look like an international bully if he authorizes direct military action. And even though he now knows that his pre-election claims of a missile gap had been wildly inaccurate, he still worries that any overt American moves might provoke a dangerous and unnecessary confrontation with the Soviets. He orders the plan to be scaled back. 4 days later, Dulles returns with a new strategy. The landing will now take place in a remote area called the Bay of Pigs. If the blow strikes here, he says, it will be easier for the United States to deny its involvement. He again tells the president that the plan can succeed without direct U.S. intervention. Kennedy is reassured. He has a high regard for the CIA and also knows that the Joint Chiefs of Staff have accepted this proposal. After further consultations with his top advisors, Kennedy gives the go-ahead. It is the first major decision of his presidency. Monday, April 17th. After a pre-invasion airstrike by the exiles in American planes disguised with Cuban markings, the anti-Castro brigade charges ashore at the Bay of Pigs. It is a disaster from the start. Thousands of loyal Cuban troops seal off the beaches while Castro's Air Force pounds the invasion force. Instead of rising up against their leader, the Cuban people seem to be rallying around him. In the White House, the men responsible for persuading Kennedy to undertake the invasion insist that it can still succeed if only the president will order U.S. naval and air forces to intervene. Kennedy refuses. He insists that he doesn't want the United States to be directly involved. Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Arleigh Burke angrily retorts, "Hell, Mr. President, we are involved." Kennedy can't believe what he's hearing. The very same people who were so sure that the plan would succeed without American help are now telling him exactly the opposite. How could they have been so wrong? Kennedy doesn't know it yet, but many of his advisors hadn't been wrong. They knew all along that this would happen, but they had believed so strongly in the importance of the invasion that they felt justified in misleading their commander-in-chief. They hoped that once the troops were ashore, Kennedy would agree to anything rather than see the operation fail. They were wrong. Kennedy is adamant in his refusal. Even though he feels a tremendous sense of personal responsibility for the men trapped on the beach, he will not allow American forces to be committed to an operation that could snowball into a full-scale invasion, or worse, lead to a nuclear showdown with Khrushchev. After one last desperate air attack, the invasion force is overrun. In the aftermath of the failure, Kennedy feels a tremendous sense of betrayal, particularly toward the Joint Chiefs, who he thinks should have known better than to approve such a terrible idea. But he also knows that the ultimate responsibility lies with him. He had been the commander-in-chief. If he had scrutinized the plan more thoroughly, the disaster might have been avoided. In the dangerous atmosphere of the Cold War, with the threat of nuclear destruction lurking behind every military decision, Kennedy now knows that he must take a far more active role in the operations of his military high command. While Kennedy assesses his defeat, Khrushchev makes the most of his opportunity. He angrily denounces the United States as an imperialist menace, accusing the Kennedy administration of unlawfully attempting to crush a tiny and defenseless neighbor. Even though he is fully aware that America's nuclear arsenal is far superior to his own, Khrushchev darkly threatens nuclear retaliation should another invasion be mounted. But privately, the Soviet premier is elated. He has been given another opportunity to humiliate America before the world. What's more, his earlier assessment of the new American president has been confirmed. In his mind, Kennedy has shown decisive evidence of weakness and indecision. But Khrushchev knows that he can't rely on nuclear bluffs to deter the Americans indefinitely. If the Soviet Union is to be a true superpower, he must find a way to match the Americans' nuclear capability. If not in numbers, then at least in effect. And in Kennedy's hesitation during the Bay of Pigs crisis, Khrushchev thinks he sees a way to accomplish his goal. May 20th, 1962. Vacationing at his retreat in the Crimea, Khrushchev decides to covertly ship a force of medium-range nuclear missiles to Castro's island nation. He knows that the risks will be incredible, but he has risen to the top of the largest nation on Earth because he has been willing to take chances. And the potential benefits of his Cuban scheme are too tantalizing to ignore. Not only would it allow him to greatly increase his nuclear leverage with the Americans, but it would also serve to ensure the continued survival of a budding communist regime. It would demonstrate to the communist world that he isn't afraid to stand up to the United States. But most importantly, it would buy him time while he builds more bombs to catch up with America's awesome nuclear might. Secrecy is the key. Khrushchev knows that he must not tip his hand before the rockets are installed. As for President Kennedy, Khrushchev believes that he will pose no threat. After all, he had backed down once on Cuba already. Why would he be willing to go to war over the basing of a few missiles there now? In early July, the plan is accepted by Castro. Back in the Soviet Union, preparations begin at once. The machinery is set in motion. In a matter of days, the shipments will begin. August 22nd, 1962. President Kennedy meets with the new director of the CIA, John McCone. Over the last several weeks, U.S. photographic reconnaissance has confirmed increased shipments of Soviet personnel and military equipment to Cuba. So far, all the weaponry appears to be defensive in nature. But McCone believes he has detected a more ominous purpose for the buildup. He tells the president that he believes the defensive weapons are being introduced to protect something bigger: offensive nuclear missiles. Kennedy listens carefully, but he is not convinced. His closest advisors have already heard of McCone's theory and dismissed it. To them, it smacks of the same kind of guesswork that led the CIA to insist that Cuba would rise in revolt against Castro after the Bay of Pigs invasion. Kennedy is inclined to agree. With important midterm congressional elections barely 2 months away and a domestic crisis brewing over civil rights, the last thing he intends to do is push the panic button just because the CIA cries wolf. Nevertheless, Kennedy orders a study of his military options should nuclear missiles be put in Cuba. Meanwhile, Soviet ships continue to unload weapons and men at Cuban ports. As the evidence mounts, Kennedy becomes more concerned and privately seeks an explanation from the Soviets. On September 4th, Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin assures the president that any Soviet moves in Cuba are strictly defensive. 2 days later, Kennedy receives a personal message from Khrushchev himself. Nothing will be undertaken before the American congressional elections that could complicate the international situation or aggravate the tension in the relations between our countries. I do not wish to become involved in your internal political affairs. Secretly, Khrushchev plans to reveal his missile deployment the day after the American elections. He will fly to Havana. Then, standing arm in arm with his comrade Fidel, he will announce his triumph to the world. But America will not be fooled so easily. With Kennedy's approval, high-flying U-2 spy planes crisscross the island, searching for any scrap of evidence they can find. And on October 14th, a U-2 brings back photos that confirm the administration's worst fears. Tuesday, October 16th, 8:45 a.m. McGeorge Bundy, Kennedy's national security advisor, steps purposefully off the elevator to the president's private quarters. He finds the president in his pajamas sitting on his bed, reading the New York Times. Staring up at him is a front-page headline: Eisenhower calls president weak on foreign policy. Mr. President, Bundy says, there is now hard photographic evidence that the Russians have offensive missiles in Cuba. As Kennedy studies the photos, he orders Bundy to set up a meeting of his top advisors. Then he calls his closest confidant, his younger brother Bobby, the Attorney General. We have some big trouble, he tells him. I want you over here. The 14 officials designated by the president to be his key advisors during the crisis gather in the cabinet room of the White House. Among them are Bundy, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Maxwell Taylor, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and 35-year-old Robert Kennedy. As the president enters, the mood is tense. Many of these men already know about the Soviet missiles and have been working throughout the night to formulate potential responses. Kennedy is furious at Khrushchev's deception, but more important is the effect the missiles could have on the security of the United States. The president is told that most major American cities fall within range of the 16 rockets now on the island. If the nuclear missiles become operational, millions of American men, women, and children could be vaporized in minutes, and without warning. Kennedy makes it clear to all present that he will not tolerate the Soviet missiles. One way or another, they must be removed. General Taylor and most of the other members favor immediate airstrikes to take out the missile sites. Kennedy leans in that direction, but having learned his lesson during the Bay of Pigs fiasco, he wants more information before he makes up his mind. He orders McNamara to send out more U-2 flights, impressing everyone with the need for absolute secrecy. Nothing must happen to alert the Soviets that their plan has been discovered. Over the next 48 hours, Kennedy labors to find a plan that will remove the missiles without touching off a disastrous nuclear exchange with the Soviets. Many of his advisors continue to press for immediate military action. Khrushchev's troops are working night and day to make the missiles operational. The longer the president waits, they argue, the worse the situation becomes. But Kennedy quickly realizes that even massive air attacks won't guarantee that all the missiles will be eliminated. He also worries that Khrushchev might be forced to retaliate if Russians are killed by the airstrikes. During a meeting on October 18th, the president asks his aggressive Air Force Chief of Staff, General Curtis LeMay, how he thinks the Soviets would respond if he ordered the bombings. They'll do nothing, snaps the general. Once again, Kennedy can't believe what he's hearing from his military advisors. The last thing he wants to do is take action that could escalate into World War III, and an armed assault might do just that. But LeMay and most of the other military men are adamant. They urge Kennedy to order an all-out attack, and the sooner the better. With the threat of nuclear annihilation dangling over their heads, Kennedy refuses to be stampeded into a rash decision. More and more, he is becoming convinced that another, less provocative strategy must be tried. Of his general's continued insistence on military action, he says, "They have one thing going for them. If we do what they want us to do, none of us will be alive later to tell them they were wrong." 72 hours later, the president announces his decision.
Acting, therefore, in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
Kennedy has decided on a full-scale naval blockade. He has drawn a line around Cuba and dared Khrushchev to cross it. But he has still given the Soviet premier room to maneuver by avoiding the use of direct military force. Yet even as he gives Khrushchev precious time to reconsider his actions, Kennedy sends a clear message that he is deadly serious about ending the Soviet buildup.
Should these offensive military preparations continue, thus increasing the threat to the hemisphere, further action will be justified. I have directed the armed forces to prepare for any eventuality.
As the president speaks, across the country and around the world, in missile silos, on air bases, and in Polaris submarines, U.S. forces prepare for nuclear war. This time, Kennedy will not back down. When he learns of the president's announcement, Khrushchev is stunned. The youthful American is showing more backbone than he had bargained for. But Khrushchev hasn't come this far to turn tail and run. He sends orders to his commanders at sea to ignore the blockade. Then he fires off a scorching note to Kennedy. The measures outlined in your statement represent a serious threat to peace. No state whatsoever has the right to establish control of vessels bound for Cuba in international waters. Tuesday, October 23rd. At 7 p.m., Kennedy answers Khrushchev by signing the proclamation ordering the blockade to begin. He then throws himself into the task of personally overseeing the operation. His military commanders bristle at Kennedy's tight control. But Kennedy makes it clear that he is the nation's commander-in-chief, and if anyone is going to make a decision that might start a nuclear holocaust, it's going to be him. The President bombards Navy Chief of Staff Admiral George Anderson with questions about the blockade. He orders that in every instance, all possible restraint will be used to force Soviet ships to comply, and not a single shot is to be fired without his personal authorization. The next day in Moscow, Khrushchev begins to show signs of strain. He summons an American businessman and friend of Secretary Rusk's, who happens to be in Russia to discuss patent procedures, and delivers a bellicose 3-hour lecture. He tells the man to deliver a message. If Americans sink Soviet ships, my submarines will sink U.S. ships, and there will be world war. But Khrushchev looks exhausted, and at the end of the meeting he reveals his growing sense of frustration with Kennedy when he exclaims, "How can I deal with a man who is younger than my son?" Meanwhile, work on the missile sites is speeding up as 27 Soviet merchant ships, some of them escorted by submarines, plow toward Cuba. Waiting for them along the blockade line are 56 American warships. Wednesday, October 24th, 10 a.m. In the White House, Kennedy listens in taut silence with the rest of his advisors as Secretary McNamara announces that 2 Soviet ships, escorted by a submarine, are closing in on the quarantine line. If they try to force a passage, there will be no alternative but to attack the submarine with depth charges. For President John F. Kennedy, it is the most intense moment of his life, and he feels every bit of the enormous weight on his shoulders. He knows that in a matter of minutes, he might have to give orders that would lead to engulfing the world in a nuclear inferno. His face seems drawn, his eyes pained. But he knows that the next move is up to Khrushchev. All he can do now is wait. Wait as the fate of the world hangs in the balance. 10:25 a.m. A messenger bursts into the room with a report. The Soviet ships have stopped dead in the water on the edge of the quarantine line. A few minutes later, a second report adds that some Soviet ships are turning around and heading for home. Secretary Rusk turns and says, "We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." Kennedy quickly issues orders forbidding the Navy to interfere with the retreat. But he knows that the crisis isn't over yet. Khrushchev has blinked, but he hasn't backed down. For the next 3 days, tensions surrounding the blockade remain at a fever pitch. On direct orders from Kennedy, 2 Soviet ships carrying non-military cargoes are allowed to pass through the line. It is a signal to Khrushchev, a signal that even in the midst of this critical moment, reason might still prevail. Friday, October 26th. At exactly 6 p.m., the teletypes in the State Department spring to life. It is a long personal letter from Nikita Khrushchev to President Kennedy. Mr. President, I see that you are not devoid of understanding of the character of contemporary war. If indeed war should break out, then it would not be in our power to stop it, for such is the logic of war. I have participated in 2 wars and know that war ends only when it has rolled through cities and villages, everywhere sowing death and destruction. Let us therefore show statesmanlike wisdom. This, Mr. President, is my proposal. No more weapons to Cuba, and those within Cuba withdrawn or destroyed. And you reciprocate by withdrawing your blockade, and also agree not to invade Cuba. We and you ought not to pull on the ends of the rope in which you have tied the knot of war, because the more the two of us pull, the tighter the knots will be tied. Therefore, if there is no intention to tighten that knot, and thereby to doom the world to the catastrophe of thermonuclear war, then let us not only relax the forces pulling on the ends of the rope, let us take measures to untie that knot. We are ready for this. As he reads Khrushchev's words, Kennedy feels a strange sense of kinship with his Soviet adversary, as if he is the only other person on earth who fully understands Khrushchev's inner feelings. He too has been gripped with fear. He too has glimpsed the basic insanity of the Cold War. That two men sitting on opposite sides of the globe should be able to decide the fate of mankind. Now, more than ever, Kennedy is resolved to find a peaceful way out of the labyrinth. And he does. The showdown ends 48 hours later when Khrushchev publicly accepts the terms set forth in his letter to the president. The world heaves a massive sigh of relief. The Cuban Missile Crisis is over. The most dangerous moment in human history had passed, but its effects continue to be felt for years. Realizing the enormous responsibility they had to avoid another nuclear crisis, John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev moved swiftly toward concluding a treaty banning the further testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. It was the first small step in thawing the Cold War. The first, President Kennedy hoped, in many to come.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. I speak to you tonight in a spirit of hope. 18 years ago, the event of nuclear weapons changed the course of the world, as well as the war. Since that time, all mankind has been struggling to escape from the darkening prospect of mass destruction on Earth. Yesterday, a shaft of light cut into the darkness. Negotiations were concluded in Moscow on a treaty to ban all nuclear tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. For the first time, an agreement has been reached on bringing the forces of nuclear destruction under international control. Now, for the first time in many years, the path of peace may be open. No one can be certain what the future will bring. My fellow Americans, let us take that first step.
Less than 4 months later, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was dead, cut down by an assassin's bullet as his motorcade drove through the streets of Dallas, Texas. Within a year of Kennedy's tragic death, Nikita Khrushchev fell from power. Condemned in part for his adventurism in Cuba, he was toppled in a bloodless coup in October 1964. He lived out his remaining years in quiet obscurity, in the countryside from which he had emerged so many years before. In the aftermath of their brief time on the center of the world stage, John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev became highly controversial figures. For Kennedy, the glowing image of Camelot, which grew in part because of his untimely death, was shattered by scandalous accusations of everything from plagiarism to marital infidelity. To some, he became a shallow man of low moral character, a purely political animal whose only guiding principle was naked personal ambition. For others, Khrushchev became almost a caricature, an erratic and bombastic clown who could threaten nuclear war one day and joyfully pound his fists on the table at the United Nations the next. While some of these perceptions may be true, one fact is undeniable. During the 6 days of their terrifying showdown in October of 1962, John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev found a way out of the world's first nuclear standoff. Kennedy was able to show moderation and yet still take a strong stand. Khrushchev saw the error of his Cuban gamble and backed down. Because they did, the United States and the Soviet Union avoided a conflict that could have destroyed the world.